Hi, everyone. Today we're going to have our second part of cruising in Belgium, and this time we're going to talk about Western Flanders. Many of you would have joined us last time when we talked about the Scheldt River and some of its tributaries, but this time we're going to be talking about the western part of Flanders. From our earlier talks, many of you will know that my husband Howard and I we own a barge, and we've cruised for about 6 months each year from 2017 to 2019. Now, we travel quite slowly, only about 7.5 kilometres per hour, and usually only 20 or 30 kilometres per day. And we don't travel every day. On average, we travel every third or fourth day. Sometimes we stay longer, sometimes we just travel the next day. We don't just go to the touristy places, we go to a lot of small towns which really aren't on tourist maps for Australians. You may have seen this slide before as well. This is Belgium, and we're going to spend all of our time today in the green section in Flanders, where they speak Flemish, which is a Dutch language. And we're going to be concentrating on this area in the very west of the Flemish region in Flanders. Now, Belgium is known as the battlefield of Europe. It's because of its strategic location between Netherlands, Germany, and France, and its history of contact between different cultures, and also, of course, because the wars fought on its soil. One of the most famous wars, of course, was in 1815, the Battle of Waterloo, which ended Napoleon's resurgence in Europe. Now, Waterloo itself is only 20 kilometres from Brussels. Of course, Belgium didn't exist at that time. It was only after the war. And in fact, during the war, that piece of land, Belgium, was given to the Netherlands. But after the war, in about 1830, there was what they call a Belgian Revolution, and Belgium became a separate country. And part of their constitution was that they would remain neutral. And we were told by some people that Belgium was seen as a buffer nation between the powerful Netherlands and France. Of course, that's not how it worked out. In World War I, Germany wanted to attack France, and there were very strong fortifications on the border between France and Germany. So they thought, I know what we'll do. We'll go through Belgium and attack France from the north. So on the 2nd of August 1940, they invaded Luxembourg, and they gave an ultimatum to Belgium, demanding passage through the country. On the 4th of August, the Belgian government refused their demands. I'm sure they had quite a bit of conversation. And the British government guaranteed military support to Belgium. And on the same day, the Germans crossed the border into Belgium, and so started the Second World War. Well, it's already started. By the 16th of October in the same year, Germany had basically overrun most of the country and were racing to the sea. In early November, the swiftly advancing German army had been halted, and the Western Front was fairly settled for the rest of the war. Now, this particular This particular picture shows the green is the area that the Belgians actually invaded. Netherlands was, of course, neutral. And so they did indeed advance into France across the Belgian border. But if you look in this very far right, you'll see this is a tiny part of Belgium that didn't get occupied by the Germans. And we're going to spend a bit of time looking at that. Here's a bit of a closer look. And these are the 4 towns with the red dots that we're going to look at: Newport, Dixmude, Ypres, and Van. And that dark black line is roughly the German front line in Belgium during World War I. So as we visited each city, we heard about the war from their point of view, and we're going to visit those and talk a bit about the war in Western Flanders. So the first city we're going to visit is Newport, and that's right on the coast and is a port city. So I'm going to show you this map a few times, which is just showing you Western Flanders. Last time when we spoke, you would have seen Ghent, and we didn't really go any further west than that, and the cities we're going to look today are in this sort of region here. So Newport is on the sea, and it's in normal calm times. It's quite touristy. We were there in October, so it was pretty windy and not really full of tourists, but I'm sure on a hot day this would be very popular. That's one of the local quite cute lighthouses. And this is the harbour that we moored in, the marina. We had to actually come up between those boats into our mooring, which was right at the end on the wall. And we told them how big we were, and we only just squeezed into our mooring. You can see we've got like about a metre or less than a metre there for us to squeeze into. So that was quite a trick to get in there. So the old part of Newport was completely destroyed in the First World War. Newport was basically in no man's land. The Germans were on one side and the Allies were on the other side, and basically it got bombed completely and was rubble. After the war, the town was completely rebuilt. They actually got old plans and pictures and rebuilt based on not a particular point in time, but the best of the past. So some of these lovely old buildings are actually fairly new, built in like the 1920s. This is the church, which also had to be rebuilt a second time because in the Second World War it got bombed as well. Now, this is a statue of Albert I. He was the king of Belgium at that time. And much of the reason he was much loved by the Belgian people was because of what he did in World War I. First of all, he refused to give in to Germans' request for passage through Belgium. And then he personally led the armed forces. He held off the German forces long enough to allow Britain and France to rally their troops. And he stayed in Belgium during the whole of the war. This is another memorial to him. And some of the other things he did is actually fought alongside his troops and shared their dangers. He just didn't sit behind and tell them to off you go, you'll be fine. And his wife also, Queen Elizabeth, she worked as a nurse at the front. He allowed his 12-year-old son to enlist in the Belgian army as a private and fight in the ranks. He refused to participate in some of the battles as he thought it was an unnecessary waste of lives. And if you look at the death rates amongst the soldiers, you'll see that the Belgian army came out much better than some of the other Allied armies. This is the King Albert I monument. The West Front Museum is underneath this monument. And you can see here that it looks out over the Gansepoort, which is a lock complex in Newport. And that lock complex was very important during the First World War. This is another view of the lock complex. So I'm actually standing on top of the Albert Memorial, and you can see there all the various gates and things that are used. So this basically, if you look at this next one, which isn't my photo, this is taken around the time of the First World War or soon after. On the left, the water comes in from the sea. So these are tidal locks, and each of the locks goes off into a various different direction. So the lock keepers during the Second World War had an idea that they could actually halt the German advance by managing water, actually releasing water into farmland. So the idea was that they would open the lock and leave water there to stop the German advance, and the water would be not shallow enough for a man to walk through and not deep enough for a boat. Of course, to do this, they had to have the lock open at high tide and closed at low tide to keep the water levels up. So it was important. They had to keep come back day and night to make sure that the locks were open and closed at all the right time. It was a lot of dangerous maintenance, and of course the Germans were desperately trying to stop it all from happening so that the water would drain out and they could get through. This is a little diagram that I was able to find showing the extent of the flooding. So the flooding actually happened between the Isa River and the old railway embankment. And it made a big difference to the war. One day we were cycling along the railway embankment and we found this little memorial to the 1914 Christmas. So on Christmas Eve, the two sides, the Germans and the Allies, were trying to kill each other. On Christmas Day, they shared a drink and songs and things. And then on Boxing Day, they tried to kill each other again, basically. The leaders weren't very happy because they were worried that they would become friendly and wouldn't want to kill each other. So that kind of fraternisation was banned after that first year. Second place we're going to is called Dixmude. It's on the Isa River. This is where it is. You can see that along the Isa River. And it was actually on the German side of the Isa River. So it was in the German hands during the First World War. We moored there for 2 winters. One winter, in the winter of 2017-18. And that's us and our mooring on the river. And it's a lovely spot with looking out over the other ones. Now, throughout the town of Dixmude, they have photos up of what the town looked like. This is what it looked like in 1916. And this is what it looked like in 1918. So every building in Dixmude was damaged, and some of them were completely destroyed. And you can see that they have, like Newport, completely rebuilt the buildings. This is a shot of the main square, which was being rebuilt while we were there. In the front is the City Hall, and behind is the St. Nicholas Church. And they were completely rebuilt after the First World War. And on the right, behind, you can see a belfry, which is one of those UNESCO belfries that we talked about before. There's also a Béguinage, which was rebuilt after the war, and this is one on the UNESCO World Heritage List. I thought that was a pretty cute statue, so I put that in there. One of the other main things to see in Dixmude is the Isa Torrey. The Isa River was the front line in this area, so that the tower of the Isa Museum houses the Isa Tower, houses the Isa Museum, which belongs to the United Nations networks of peace museums. And it's over 9 floors and tells stories of what it was like in the trenches and the story of the war on the Isa. And some of the stories about rats, trench foot, poison gases, madness was very moving. But the torrent itself has a story. So the initials AVV, VVK in Dutch mean all for Flanders, Flanders for Christ. And this area became one of the most important symbolic political locations for the Flemish movement. During the First World War, most of the leaders were Wallonian and spoke French, and most of the soldiers were Flemish and didn't speak French. So there wasn't a lot of love lost between the leaders and the actual soldiers. And in the Second World War, apparently there was some collaboration between the Flemish and the Germans. They felt they had a lot more in common with the Germans than they did with the Wallonians. And in 1946, the original tower of this Isa Tower was blown up. It was rebuilt again in 1965 with a similar design, but the remains of the old tower are there. So in this photo, you can see the old tower in the foreground and in the background, the new tower. Some of the building materials from the old tower was reused, and modelled into what they call the Peace Port or the Pax Port, and that was built in 1950. This is a view from the top of the tower looking back over to Dixmude, the town, on the other side of the river. And this is the view of the Isa River and the marina, and that's our boat just in there behind the trees. Next town we're visiting is Ypres. So in Dutch, it's Ypres, in French, it's Ypres. And that's down here. It's at the end of the canal. So you have to make a trip there. You can't do it on your way to somewhere else. And here it is. So the Ypres was, during the First World War, in the centre of the salient. The salient is a curve or bulge in the front line, and that was all the way around Ypres. The theory about a salient is it made it easy for the Allied forces because it was easier to defend the inside of a curve than it was to defend the outside of a curve. But In fact, the Germans had the better positions on higher ground, so the benefit of the salient wasn't very much. Over 500,000 people died here in World War I. So when we stayed in Ypres after our mooring in Dixmude, this is where we moored, which is a lovely, we're right at the end of the canal. So the canal heads up there to the right, and on this end it stops. So we're moored right at the end of the canal. And we stayed there for about 10 days in 2018. And we just really liked this harbour. It was safe, it was relatively secure. Right, you get in by the stairs over here, and this is the captain's, where the harbour captain lives. So he looks out his window, he can see all the boats in the harbour. It was friendly and it was cheap. So we got to know the people in this boat very well. And there's another boat moored on the other side of us at the moment where the people are our friends. So we were lucky enough, we left the boat there for the winter in 2019, and it's been there for over 2 years now and still is happy and safe. Now, I skipped this photo because coming from Dixmude in the spring of 2018, I had unfortunately had a bike accident and had my arm in a cast. So we needed help. So some of the people from the Ypres harbour came over. One of them had a car. She drove the others over, and this was our crew bringing us over. So Carol and I had a good old chat. We knew each other from the year before, and the boys brought the boat, which is great. So one of the main sights to see in Ypres is the Cloth Hall, and it was one of the largest commercial buildings in the Middle Ages. It served as the main market and warehouse for the Flemish city's prosperous cloth industry. The original structure was erected mainly in the 13th century and completed in 1304. The hall is 125 metres wide and 70 metres. Sorry, the belfry itself, which is a UNESCO belfry, is 70 metres high. It now houses the In Flanders Field Museum, which is an amazing and large museum talking about the First World War and especially the area and the salient area. Now, if you look at this photo, you'll see that in 1918, that's what the Cloth Hall looked like. So it just lay in ruins. Artillery fire devastated Ypres, and although it was a main centre, it wasn't in good shape. So after the war, between 1933 and 1967, the Cloth Hall was meticulously reconstructed to its pre-war condition. In many cases, they were able to use the same stones when they were able to identify them. Now, this is the end of the Cloth Hall on the left. So this building here is the end of the Cloth Hall. And there are restaurants here that are on the Mark Square, all of which would have been rebuilt as well. This is more photos from the main square. There's beautiful buildings, and it's hard to imagine how much work has gone into recreating these old buildings. That's the town hall on the other side of the main square, also a lovely building. The main square, unfortunately, apart from market day, is a parking lot. Now, the other thing in Ypres is the Menin Gate. So the Menin Gate Memorial to the Missing was dedicated to British and colonial soldiers who were killed in Ypres salient in World War I and whose graves are unknown. So it's on the eastern exit of the town and marks the starting point for one of the main roads out of town that led Allied soldiers to the front line. Although some people think in much of the time it was so close to the fighting that people would sneak out another way. And if you look back through the gate, you can see there the tower of the belfry and one of the streets leading into town. So the Menin Gate Memorial was built by the Imperial War Graves Commission, which is now called the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and was unveiled on the 24th of July 1927. So it's got a hall of memory, and there are names on stone panels of over 54,000 Commonwealth soldiers who died in the salient, but whose bodies haven't never been recovered or found. But it was found to be too small, and there are other memorials to the missing in the salient area. I learnt when I was just getting some facts that the New Zealanders chose not to be included on this, so they're on one of the other ones. So every day at 8 p.m, buglers from the Last Post Association close the road and then sound the last post. Now, these Belgian people from the citizens of Belgium or citizens of Ypres who wanted to express their gratitude towards those who had given their lives for Belgium's freedom. And this has happened every day since 1928, except during the Second World War when it was occupied by Germans again. But during that time, they did the ceremony at the Brookwood Military Cemetery in Surrey, England. So we went there on Anzac Day Eve, and of course there was a bunch of these students there. And individuals or groups are allowed to lay a wreath to commemorate the fallen, and this group of students representative that did that on that day. The next morning was the dawn service, which they hold at the Butts New British Ceremony at Polygod Wood in Sonnebeek, which is not very far from Ypres. It's in the salient area. And we hired a car because we didn't fancy going there on our bikes at like 5 o'clock in the morning. It was very special because, of course, it was 2018, so it's a 100-year anniversary of the end of the Great War. This is the cemetery after the ceremony when things are starting to go up. And it was really moving and we were really pleased we went. Afterwards, they actually put on a breakfast. It was just at a local town hall. But it was so nice to see so many Belgians turning up who wanted to thank the Australians and New Zealanders for their help. After the breakfast, we took advantage of our hire car and we went to a few cemeteries in the area, including Tyncott. At Tyncott, there are another nearly 35,000 unknown or missing soldiers inscribed on their memorial to the missing. Now, most Commonwealth War grave cemeteries have a cross of sacrifice. And this one, they've actually built it on top of a German pillar box. There are almost 12,000 burials, of which 70% are unnamed. And sometimes there was more than one person in a grave. This particular gravestone says 6 soldiers of the Great War unknown, also known unto God. So basically 6 people, they don't know who the hell they are. So the reason there's a lot of Commonwealth war graves in the area is there was a decision made to not repatriate the bodies back to their home countries. People had come from all over the world and they decided that they would do that, unlike places like France and Germany where people would go home. So the land on which the British and Commonwealth cemeteries are located has been given in gratitude by the Belgian nation. The Ypres salient area now contains the resting place of many thousands of soldiers and airmen in over 100 British and Commonwealth military cemeteries, 1 German, 2 French and 1 Belgian military cemetery. Commonwealth graves managed by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. This photo just shows you, the I stands for the Imperial War Graves Commission. So these are old signs. And this is how to get to all the different ceremonies on this side of town. Now, this particular cemetery, is located just down the canal from where we were mooring. It was an easy bike ride for us. And it was located near a dressing station. So there was a dressing station and people would be basically triaged there and fixed up if they could, and they may be shipped off to a hospital, but of course many of them died. So there was a graveyard outside the back door of the dressing station. And that's quite common, that some of the cemeteries are exactly where the men died and were first buried. But in some cases, they've reinterred people from smaller cemeteries into larger cemeteries like Tyncott. So as I said before, there's a lot of graves of soldiers who were unknown. They didn't know who they were. So this is just yet another huge cemetery. This is the German cemetery, which has a totally different feel to it. We visited this one day. We thought it would be interesting to go and see. Now, of course, we were there in 2018, so there were a lot of art installations and memorials for the anniversary. Now, this is one that we'd seen the previous year when we were in Newport, they were creating these little people. They're just tiny little things, and you could create them. You paid $5 or $10 and you could create a little person or thing, and then they put them all together to create the whole thing the next year. And each person, each one of these little clay things represent one person who died in the Great War. And you can see they just had acres and acres and acres of them. And this is another memorial, which I thought was impressive, although I didn't get to read exactly what it was about. Now, this is Hill 60. I know it doesn't look like a hill, but one of the things that was happening in the First World War, there was a lot of tunnelling going on, and they would tunnel underneath the German positions, and then they'd use explosive to destroy the positions, usually in line with some kind of big offensive. So Hill 60 was blown up. I think it was the Battle of Messines, and they had multiple places where they put explosive and blew it up. So this is now just a lake. It used to be a little hill. And this is a nice little path through a glade of trees. And there's actually you can't really read it, but this is the sign here showing where I think that's the Allied front line was, and it will give you the date and so forth. And then you walk along this path, and 100 metres or so, there'll be another line explaining where the German line was, only about 100 or a couple of 100 metres away. So from Ypres, we went to Fintel. Now, Fintel, you can see we just went up the Ypres Canal, and we turned left and went down to Fintel. But when we left Ypres, we had a problem with our heating, and we had to stop. And this is Howard and our friend Barry trying to, they created a couple of, this is a bent broom to try and clean out the raw water cooler under the boat. They also created a thing called the unbungerer, which we've used on multiple occasions, where you blow air down it and it can force things out of the raw water cooler that might be blocking it. So we actually spent an extra night in Ypres after that because of the problems we're having with the cooling. Anyway, we finally set off. This is one of my friendly herons that I like. So we came out of the Ypres Canal over here. We did a U-turn. We stayed for lunch here and let the boat cool down because it had overheated again. And then we set off down here towards Fintel. In the other direction is Dixmude. But we also called our local mechanic, and he arranged for a diver to meet us at Fintel. And the diver went under the boat and managed to clear out our problem so that we had clear water going into the raw water cooler. So this is our mooring at Fintel, lovely little spot. And this is Howard catching lots of fish in the canal. This is the lock at Fintel. And it's a historic lock, and it's very interesting because it has sloping walls. We don't know why, but luckily they've built a sort of a jetty there so that we can moor up easily. So in the good old days, they probably had to hold the boat off from the sides. Very strange, but interesting lock. So from Fintel, it's another day's driving to Vern. Vern, also you can see down here, it's only a hop, step and a jump from the border with France. And in fact, it's one day's cruising and you get to Dixmude. So in fact, we actually hired a car and went down to Dixmude for a day, sorry, not Dixmude, Dunkirk, and went down to Dunkirk for a day, which was a lot of fun. And if you're looking back at our map of the front line, Vern is in Free Belgium during the First World War. It was behind the lines, and it was the only major city that was really free in the First World War. So this is our mooring, and as you can see, there's quite a high, we're up against a very high quay. So to get on and off the boat, we actually set our gangplank up on the roof of the boat to get on and off the boat, and then had to sort of go across the gangplank and then climb that fence. So we had to sort of, anyway, it wasn't very easy, especially since I still had my arm in a sling and there wasn't really anywhere I could easily hang on to. So when I was getting onto the roof, which for me, felt like the most dangerous part was how it would be there in case I didn't feel stable. But luckily, we also had friends. Other DBA members were actually staying in Van when we arrived, and they immediately took us out for lunch, which was delightful. Lovely way to be welcomed. So this is the Verne Belfry, part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's also called the Cecilia Tower from 1628. And you can see that although it has a square base, it then has an octagonal superstructure, and then they have the lantern on the top. And it's quite an impressive building. This next picture, you can see the belfry in the background. And in the front is this building that now houses the Free Fatherland Experience Centre. And this museum talks about what it was like behind the front line in the only small area of Belgium that wasn't occupied. There's a lot of information about the royal family who were based in Verne, how they lived, how the people in the town were affected by the war, especially, hospitals there, troops coming back for a rest after fighting on the French line, and so on and so forth. A lovely town. And of course, these buildings aren't reconstructed. They really are the original old buildings. So the large building in behind there, this is the main square or the Grootmarkt. The building in behind is St. Nicholas Kirk. This is inside St. Nicholas Kirk. And this is another view of the main square. Another nice building. This is the other church, St. Walburga Kirk, which looks quite different inside because of the red brick that they've used rather than the marble and the white stone of the other church. This is the station in Bern. So our next town that we're visiting is Courtrai, also known as Courtrai in French. This is Courtrai here, and it was just an easy bus ride for us to go from Ypres to Courtrai. And I wanted to get away from all the stories of the horror of World War I. And so we caught the train to Courtrai, but you never really get totally away from war. So in 1302, there was the Battle of the Golden Spurs against France, and that resulted in victory for Flanders. And that date is now commemorated as a Flemish holiday. So that was really big news for the Flemish to win a battle. Of course, the France retook Flanders only 26 years later. That's still known as a thing. Now, these are the Brol Towers in this picture, and they're one of the most important symbols of the city of Courtrai. On the left, the southern tower was built in 1385 to control traffic on this river, which is the Lay River. The northern tower, built in 1415, was used as an armoury. And this is the old River Lay, but as you can see, it's quite small, and it's certainly not big enough for the big barges that now go up and down the Lay. So they've built a bypass canal, if you like, and this is the bypass canal. So on the right, you can see the old Lay, and on the left is the new canal, which is big. Now, we're actually moored on the old Lay, that's our boat there, and we're moored alongside Soroya, which is owned by friends of ours. And that, if you're looking back, that's the bridge that I took the previous photo from. And this is the other end of that old Lay. That's the old Lay coming out. And down here is the new canal heading off down there. And this is a lovely spot. They've created a little cafe, and it's an outdoor eating area. And it's a delightful spot on a nice sunny day to go and sit. But back into the old town, this is the Belfry, built in 1307. It's got a statue of Mercury, the god of merchants, on top. And it was originally surrounded by the cloth hall, although the cloth hall's long gone and it's freestanding now. On the other side of the square, or nearby, I should say, is the old medieval city hall built in 1520. And there's statues of the Count of Flanders. All these statues here are the Counts of Flanders on the wall of the old city hall. This is the Grootmarkt, looking from roughly where the tower is, and some other shots from around Courtrai. We went to visit the textile and linen museum. And linen was a major product in this area. And it was lovely to, we didn't know much at all about linen, and to see the process and learn more about it, how important it was and so forth. And they had this beautiful lace there. I'm going to just talk about, I don't usually talk about trips, but I thought this would be quite interesting. We're going from between Van and Bruges. So we have to first leave Van and go through the Gansepoort at Newport and then head up to Bruges. So we left Van. We could either go back to Fintel, south to Dunkirk, or north to Newport. And we had to go north to Newport. We had to go through the Gansepoort, and that's tidal. So we had to time our trip, as the locks don't operate at low tide. So we had to work out when to do that. From there, so we went through the Gansepoort through one lock, and then we had to go out the Gansepoort on the other side. And then we had to wait at the first bridge for the bridge keeper to come. And what they do is they only have a certain number of times when they're there. And what they do is they bring convoys of people down. So they bring someone down, and then they would turn around, and you and whoever's with you go up the other way. And they take you through 20 kilometres. It's about 4 or 5 bridges that they have to go through. It's very flat. So in that 20 kilometres, there's no locks. It's just the bridges that they have to open. And you can see this is the convoy coming the other way with the bridge open. They're all just coming through that final bridge. And this is one of the ports that we stayed in, Oudenburg, which is a nice little town. And then we went through the lock the next day. When we'd come down the previous year, we'd stayed at a different place, Plassendale, which is on the main Bruges-Ostend canal. And the next morning, we saw this cruise ship pass by that was obviously heading up to Bruges from Ostend. This is the canal with these beautiful trees alongside. And it's quite a wide canal there, and it has some lovely bridges. This one is sort of a swing bridge that swings sideways, I suppose you'd say. And this one, it sort of zooms up and takes the whole road on an angle up above your head. Now, this is going to be hard for me to explain, especially since, anyway. So we arrived and we moored here, and we had to call up and ask to go through the bridge. And they said, oh, no, just wait, there's a commercial coming. And then a little while later, they came back and said, oh, no, little boat, you can come through and wait here. There is a commercial coming that's going to come sooner than that, and we'd like you to go through with them. So finally, the commercial turned on. They come from this canal here, down here. And then we both set off. They opened this next bridge for us. And then we went through this next corner to go into this final lock. Now, when we came through this final corner, the final bridge wasn't open, so we had to sort of stop. And the big barge, the big commercial behind us, didn't realise that we would have to stop. And he was going quite, he had to have a lot of momentum and had to throw in his brakes to avoid missing us. We moved forward a bit to get out of his way. And there wasn't an accident, but it was a bit scary there for a moment. Once we did go in, this is a semicircular lock on this side and a fairly straight wall on this side. So being the smaller boat, we go on the semicircular side, and the big boat goes on the straight side. And if he's longer than that length, then they have to leave the bridges at both ends up. You can see that the gate's actually here. They have to leave the bridge up while the boat's in the lock, causing havoc to local traffic. And then finally, when this lock is open, they will open this bridge and the commercial will go out first, and we will then follow. Now, that lock is called the Danpoort lock. And originally there would have been 3 gates, and the third gate would go out here and it would go to Dan. That is no longer working, so it's only going this way. And then once we're out of the lock heading back around the canal, we had to scurry to keep up with the commercial, because they open the bridge for commercials and sometimes they won't open it for just a pleasure craft. So if you want to get through the bridge, you've got to stay with the commercial, or you might get left behind. So let's look at Bruges now that we're here. So Bruges, I'm sure many of you have been to Bruges, is here. And it is one of the most touristy places we've ever visited. It is, however, quite beautiful. So we spent 10 days all up in Bruges. The first time we visited, we stayed in this delightful little harbour called the Kapur, which is actually in the main part of Bruges. And it had what we thought were lovely autumn trees, but the harbour master told us that no, it's not autumn. It's actually a disease in the trees. The second time we stayed at this harbour, and this is called Flandria, and the trees here are clearly not diseased, and it's a great spot for Howard because you can fish just behind the boat. And you can see here, this is very common to what we see. These things allow you to plug in for water and for electricity. So the Bruges is the historic centre of Bruges, is a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And this is the Bruges City Hall. It's one of the oldest city halls in the lowland, and it's located on Berg Square. It was completed in 1421. Also on the Berg Square is this building. I'm not even sure what it is. But Bruges itself was a major trading centre up to about 1500, and its weavers and spinners were thought to be the best in the world. The population of Bruges grew to at least 125,000 and perhaps even up to 200,000 in around 1400 AD. This building that we're looking at is the Provincial Hof. The building was used as the government meeting hall until 1999, but now it's mainly a ceremonial building and it's also used for exhibitions. It's on the main square, the Markt, which is different to the Berg, which we saw just around the corner. So this building is also on the Markt. It's the Belfry, and it's a UNESCO World Heritage listed site, part of that listing. Now, the story about Bruges was starting in around 1500, the channel to the North Sea started silting up. And the channel was actually called the Golden Inlet. And it had actually given the town that prosperity because it was a huge trading port. It was probably equidistant between the south of Europe, like Portugal and Spain, as it was to the north of Europe, Scandinavia and the German ports. So it was a very important trading centre. It was much easier to get into than into Antwerp. And it was very rich, but it silted up so quickly that the buildings haven't changed much in all the centuries since then. The lace industry did take off in the 17th century. So this is some of the restaurants around the square, the main square. And this is also in the main square. In the last half of the 19th century, Bruges became one of the world's first tourist destinations, attracting wealthy British and French tourists. It was occupied in World War I and World War II, but it avoided any significant damage. And now the old town is full of tourists. They have day trippers from tour boats which come into Zeebrugge. They have bus tours from Brussels, and they have lots of independent tourists coming in there. So the town itself is all about tourists. Everywhere you go, there's beautiful buildings and beautiful sights to see. So Bruges, like a few other cities, is known as the Venice of the North, along with St. Petersburg, Amsterdam, and a few others. But there's lots and lots of canals there, and there's lots of tourist boats as well. This is just some of the canals, shots of the canals and the buildings around them that I'm showing you at the moment. It's a delightful city to just walk around. Unfortunately, we're too big to just go on those little canals. The other way tourists get around is the horse-drawn carriages. Bicycles, of course. This building, you can see the sign on 1675. This is the Ons Lieve Vrouwenkerk, the Church of Our Lady. Now, the city is surrounded by a canal. That would have been a fortification back in the old days. And there are still gates or ports into the old city that I've got photos of, many of them. And this is really unusual. In most old cities, the ports are pulled down because the openings are so tiny that cars and trucks can't get through them. But because the city was basically stopped at a point in time, they still have a lot of these old ports or gates into the city. The other thing they have is windmills along the top of the dikes, which probably would have been used for pumping water out of the city into the canals to make sure that the city itself stayed dry. Now, Dam is just up. I talked about that. It's the other canal coming out of the Dam port, goes to Dam. And in the days when Bruges was a major trading centre, Dam was actually the port for Bruges. It's only 6 kilometres from Bruges, and it is a delightful cycle out from Bruges itself. It has, of course, a windmill, town hall, and a residence stalk, and a very interesting churchyard. Back in Bruges again, the Béguinage. Of course, there's a Béguinage. Lots of it's now used for residential, so we didn't take a lot of photos in there. And this just covered in swans and visitors and ducks and all sorts of things. Of course, a waffle. My French friend who lived in Belgium for years is horrified that us Anglos like all these toppings on the waffles. And they even had waffles on sticks for the tourists. Now, one of the highlights for us was what we call Super Saturday. And it was grand final day, 2017. I'm a Richmond fan, so we got up early in the morning and we watched Richmond win the grand final, which was fabulous. We jumped into our hire car, we drove to Amsterdam, and we watched a Rolling Stones concert, which Howard is totally happy about, especially as there may not be any more, given that Charlie Watts has now died. So that was just a fabulous day, always will be known to us as Super Saturday. And I remember coming out of the stadium and going up the metro stairs and looking back at the crowds and taking this photo, and it's hard to imagine that crowd happening at the moment. Our next stop is Ostend, which is down on the coast. And it is another major harbour, still is. We visited Ostend a couple of times, once on our bike and later we came by train. So I really thought these were interesting, some kind of sculpture on the side of the harbour. Of course, there's a memorial to Albert I and Elizabeth, much loved by the Belgian people. This is the Church of St. Peter and St. Paul. Beautiful stained glass windows and quite interesting architecture, which we never really had explained to us. Memorials to soldiers and to sailors. Some interesting shops, buildings, statues, and of course the train station. The second time we went to Ostend Vor Anchor. Now this is we came by train, and this is the largest maritime festival on the North Sea. It's open for authentic ships who are at least 50 years of age or replicas based on original ships of greater than 50 years. And it was covered in ships. It was really interesting to wander around. You could actually go on board some of the ships, or you could just look at them from the outside. Some really beautiful ships. We were fortunate because we had friends who had put their ship in, Torald and Nils. Torald is, she's Swedish and Nils is Norwegian. And so that's their ship there with the Norwegian flag on it. And that was a lot of fun. And the final place we're visiting today is De Haan. Now, De Haan is on the North Sea and is listed as one of the most beautiful villages in Belgium. So I thought, well, why not? We'll go there. And we actually got there by tram. So the tram is the longest tram line in the world. It's about 70 kilometres long, and it basically covers the coastline of Belgium. That's the border with France, that's the border with the Netherlands, and that is the tram route that goes right around Newport, Ostend, Blankenberg and Knock. The tram, so we took the tram to De Haan. That's the tram station in De Haan. And it's basically a summer tourist destination. So it had all these interesting hotels for tourists. Carousel, of course. Playground for the kids. And some interesting holiday houses. This one is thatched. Now, last time we got together, people were interested to know more about locks. So we thought we'd tell you a bit more about that. So how a lock works. So the first thing is important when you come to a lock is to announce your arrival. So on all commercial waterways, we'd be using VHF. And we would usually call them about 1 kilometre before arriving at the lock and let them know that we're arriving soon. We have AIS on the boat, so they can see us using their technology. They can't see smaller boats that don't have that, but we still announce our arrival. In some places, you have to use a phone. They don't use the VHF. In some places, they actually give you a telecommand, and that is like a little remote control that they give you at the beginning of a series of lock, and you hand it in at the end, and you just press a button when you get close enough. And then you can see the lights change and so forth on the lock. Some places it's just a sensor across the river, and when you pass the sensor, it picks you up and will start preparing the lock for you. In some cases, there's a little jetty or something, and you have to go and press a button on the intercom and talk about them. Other places, we've seen a twist pole over the canal, and you have to go under the twist pole and twist it, and that starts the process for preparing the lock for you. And in some places, there's a travelling lock keeper, and he'll come with you. You arrange a time to meet him. He'll meet you, and then he'll go with you through a series of locks and prepare them, or there might be one or two, sometimes in a little van, sometimes just on a bicycle. So the next thing, when you finally arrive, you have to wait. Sometimes there's a place to moor, and sometimes we just have to loiter. In other words, just hang around in the river and try and be out of the way for the person coming out of the lock. Commercial traffic always has priority at locks and mobile bridges, and either the lock keeper or the traffic light will tell you what to do, and there's a definite sort of set of circumstances. The first one there on the left is the 2 reds. That means the lock's not in operation. That will usually mean it's out of hours. It might be lunchtime, could be after the end of the day or too early in the morning. But it could also be that the lock's broken and isn't in operation. The next one is it's in operation, doesn't know you're there though. So you need to announce that you're there, and then it should go to the next one, which is lock being prepared, which means you can't come in yet, but we know you're there and we're preparing the lock for you. In some cases, it may be that someone else has just gone in and they've closed the gates, and that person is now heading off the other way. Then they'll bring someone back. So it could still be 20 minutes or half an hour before you have access to the lock. Finally, they'll give you the green light to go in. Now, I just want to warn you that if you can see the light there, that's saying all clear, go in, but clearly not. So you do have to use some caution when following their instructions. Now, this is a bit of an explanation of how the process works. So the first one is there's a boat sailing upstream and it's announced their arrival. Then the lock gates open and you enter the lock and attach your ropes. The gates then close and they slowly fill the chamber up with water from upstream. So the crew uses the ropes to hold the boat in place. You can see that down here on lock 4, that the water is coming from up here and it's being come in there to let the water come up. Now on number 5, you'll see that the water level is now at the same level as the other side. So they open the gates, turn on the green light, and off you go through the gate. So one of the things you have to be careful of is that sometimes there can be a spillway. So in other words, if it's a river, for example, and there's a flow, there might be some way that lets excess water to go around the lock. And sometimes the entrances and exits can be quite close to the lock doors, and that can muck up your navigation to go in. And our boat is only 4.5 metre wide. Some of these locks are 5 metres wide. So when we're lining up and suddenly get hit by a flow of water that pushes you off your direction, it can be a problem, let's just say. Can be tricky. So the way they let the water in does vary. In this case, the water came through the gate, and that meant it was quite a turbulent ride inside the lock. So you have to be prepared for that. Usually there's some note in a book or a website that we've seen before we get there, and we know not to get too close to the front gate. But if you were close to that, you would be in trouble. So the process coming the other way is very similar. Of course, the boat sailing downstream announces his arrival. The boat enters the lock, attaches the ropes. They close the gates. The water is released from the lock. So you can see down the bottom there, the water is coming out down under there. And once you're down at the same level, then they open the gates and you can leave. So, just before, I want to show you the sill. So you can see here that the height of the water here is much shallower than here. So, and that often, this shows you that the gates are right on the top of what they call the sill. But often that sill sticks out a bit. So you've got to be really careful how you position the boat so you're not so far back that you can get caught on the sill. We'll just have a look at a couple of things. This is our friend Barry, and he has put the rope onto the bollards at the top. Now, it's easy if you're going down to put the rope on at the top, but when you get to the bottom, you've got to take it off. And sometimes that can be tricky. If you put the eye on there, you've got to flick it off. So that can be something you want to be a bit careful of. The other thing you've got to be careful of is not to tie your ropes up or get your ropes caught. You can actually hang the boat. So the water's going down, your rope's not moving, your boat is hanging on the rope and getting tighter and tighter and tighter. So one of two things will happen. You'll completely hang the boat and the boat will just hang sideways, or all of a sudden the rope will break and your boat will just fall. Not a good thing. The idea is you cut that rope as soon as you realise that you can't. Once it's caught, and it's taking the weight of the boat, you can't twist it. So you've got to be really careful not to twist your ropes. Now, this is our friend Alan, and he's at the back. You can see they're the miter doors, so they're on an angle. So the pressure of the water forces the doors to close when there is a difference in the water level. But once the water's at the same level, it's really easy to open the doors again. So those miter doors are really clever. One thing I will say is if it's a sea lock or a tidal lock, then they often will have a double miter door, because you don't know whether sometimes the water will be higher upstream, and sometimes it will be lower upstream because of the tide. So the miter doors, they might have a double door there. Now this photo shows the sill. You can see here that that's a guillotine gate at the top, and this is the sill sticking out there. So we've got to make sure we're quite close to it, but we've been very careful that we're not so close that we're going to get caught on the sill. The other thing you can see in this photo, so there's the sill there. The other thing you can see is down here, this is a floating bollard. So you can connect to that bollard and it will slowly go up with the water. So you can actually tie, as long as you are sure that that's working, it will come up so you don't have to do all this rope thinging. But sometimes you can't do that, and there's a series of bollards. You can see here at our friend Jean-Marie, there's a bollard here, there's a bollard here, and there's a bollard here, and he has to move it from one bollard to the next as the boat goes up or goes down. This is a commercial lock that we're sharing with a commercial, and it looks like another little passenger boat there. At the far end, the dock, you can see it's got a lifting door. The funny thing here is that's the door here, and this is concrete. So the door does lift, it lifts up from there and goes into this space here, and then you drive out underneath. And that's what it looks from the other side. You can see that door, as I've taken that photo, that door's closed, but that's the space that the people come. And we've had to go down 12 metres when we went through this lock. So that's the end of the story. I hope you found it useful and interesting. And I apologise that I forgot to tape it when I was doing the original thing. So if you had any questions, they're not recorded. And hopefully we'll see you another time. Thanks.